Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating and honestly pretty controversial election outcome. Zohran Mamdani's victory in the 2025 New York City Democratic mayoral primary. It definitely got people talking. A lot.
Oh, absolutely. And for good reason. The big question we're digging into is, how much did ranked choice voting RCV actually play into this?
Right.
Was it just reflecting what voters wanted, or did the system itself kind of shape the result in maybe unexpected ways?
Right. And we've really sifted through the sources for you, looking at arguments from, well, basically all angles, plus the details about Mamdani himself, his background, the whole dynamic of that primary. Our mission here, just to pull out those key insights, give you the full picture.
Okay, so let's get straight to it. Mamdani wins the primary.
Yeah.
And almost instantly you hear this label, radically inappropriate. Right, that's a strong starting point. What did the sources tell us about why that label stuck so quickly?
Well, the sources point to some very specific things from his past. Statements, positions. Critics highlight his 2017 rap lyrics, for instance. They claim those lyrics supported the Holy Land Foundation 5. Now, that's a group convicted on charges related to funding terrorism.
Yeah, and that's not all. The sources also mentioned his reported refusal to denounce the phrase, globalize the intifada. That phrase, as you probably know, is often seen as a call for widespread resistance against Israel. So, pretty charged stuff.
Definitely. And you have critics like Representative Andy Ogles mentioned in the material arguing these alleged ties, plus his socialist policies. They basically say it makes him unsuitable to be mayor. So it paints this picture of a really polarizing figure even before we talk about RCV.
And that polarization is key because it leads us right into how a system like RCV might factor into a win like this. One argument we see popping up in the sources is that RCV can actually amplify these really dedicated bases.
That's interesting. You'd almost think the opposite, right? That it forces broader appeal. So the idea is RCV lets candidates with intense, focused support win, even if they don't have wide appeal right out of the gate.
Exactly. Mamdani's platform progressive, strongly pro-Palestinian, backed by people like AOC. It clearly fired up a loyal base.
Yeah.
And what the sources suggest is he got a strong share of first-choice votes from them.
Okay.
Then, the way RCV redistributes votes as other candidates drop out, it likely helped him consolidate that progressive support. He could then potentially leapfrog moderates, like Andrew Cuomo perhaps, who might have had wider but maybe less passionate backing.
So the critique is that this dynamic kind of rewards candidates who energize a specific group intensely, even if they alienate others. It favors the more polarizing figures.
That's the argument, yeah. It suggests the intensity of support can matter more than the breadth, especially in the initial stages.
Wow. So it's not just who you pick first, but how committed that first choice base is and how the transfers play out. Now, another thing we saw was about vote splitting among moderates. But wait, isn't RCV supposed to fix vote splitting?
That's the theory, but it's complicated. What the sources suggest happened in 2025 is that even with RCV, the moderate candidates, think people like Catherine Garcia, Curtis Lewa maybe, they still seem to split the centrist vote in the early counting rounds.
Allowing Mamdani to take the lead initially?
Precisely. And then as the lower ranked candidates were eliminated, their votes were redistributed, but they just didn't seem to gather strongly enough around one single moderate to overtake Mamdani. The transfers didn't coalesce effectively.
So it didn't prevent the effect of vote splitting in those crucial early stages? And that sounds like what some of those ex-posts were getting at, claiming RCV basically enabled a candidate they saw as radical who might lost otherwise.
Exactly. And tied into that is another layer, this idea about perceived inappropriateness and how voters actually behave with RCV. Critics argue the RCV structure might help someone like Mamdani because voters ranking him second or third, maybe they weren't fully aware of his entire record.
That's a tricky point. How much do people research their second and third choices? That's a fair question. And what about exhausted ballots? How do they fit into this picture?
Right, the preliminary Board of Elections data we saw pointed to about 10 to 12% of ballots being exhausted. Basically, these are ballots where the voter didn't rank enough candidates. So if their top choices get eliminated, their vote just stops counting. It doesn't transfer anymore.
Okay, so 10-12% of votes just vanished from the final rounds.
Effectively, yes. And what that means is a candidate with a really solid committed base needs fewer transfer votes later on to hit that 50% plus one threshold because the total pool of active votes shrinks. So those exhausted ballots might have inadvertently helped Mamdani by reducing the number of votes potentially transferring away from him or to his rivals in the end.
It suggests maybe not enough voters used the ranking system fully to counterbalance that strong initial base.
Okay, so that's a compelling case for how RCV could have enabled this specific outcome. But our sources definitely presented the other side too. The argument that RCV actually does reflect the will of the voters, how does that argument hold up?
Well, the core point there is that RCV guarantees the winner has an actual majority over 50% after all the votes are redistributed. That's fundamentally different from first past the post, where someone can win with, say, 35% if the field is split.
Right, a plurality win versus a majority win.
Exactly. So supporters frame Mamdani's win as legitimate. They say it represents a coalition of actual NYC voters. They point to the city's demographics, 7 to 10% Muslim, 10 to 12% Jewish, various progressive groups, and argue that calling him radically inappropriate ignores the democratic choice made by people who liked his policies.
Policies like rent freezes, minimum wage, things that resonate with certain voter blocs, precisely. They'd say the system worked, it found a majority consensus, even if it wasn't everyone's first choice. And there's also the argument that RCV incentivizes broader appeal. Candidates need those second and third choice votes.
Did Mamdani's campaign seem to do that? Reach beyond his core base?
The sources suggest yes, to some extent. While clearly progressive, his campaign reportedly tried to avoid direct, harsh attacks on rivals. The thinking is, that might have made moderate progressives more willing to rank him second or third.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't just the hardcore base. It could indicate some broader appeal, at least enough to pick up those crucial later round votes, especially in a primary with, 28 to 30% turnout? Not exactly massive participation.
Right, and that leads to the argument that maybe this isn't about RCV being flawed, but simply about voter preference in this specific election.
Yeah.
NYC's Democratic primary electorate does lean progressive. And maybe Mamdani beating Cuomo wasn't just about RCV mechanics, but also reflected, real dissatisfaction with establishment figures.
That makes sense. RCV or not, maybe the underlying political currents were heading that way anyway.
Possibly. Some argue that even without RCV, if you had a crowded field splitting the moderate vote, a candidate like Mamdani still might have won, just with a smaller plurality percentage instead of a RCV majority. So RCV might have shaped the process and the type of majority, but the winner might reflect the underlying voter mood regardless.
Okay, so putting it all together, looking at the bigger picture, Mamdani's win, certified July 15th, clearly poured fuel on the fire of the RCV debate. It seems RCV likely did play a role amplifying his base, the way votes redistributed, but it wasn't the only thing going on.
Absolutely not. You have to factor in voter sentiment, that relatively low turnout, and the fact that the moderate candidates didn't seem to consolidate. It's a mix. You get these really divergent perspectives on the outcome. Critics are concerned RCV let someone win whose past statements, like on the Holy Land Foundation, might deeply trouble many New Yorkers.
Especially considering the city's large Jewish population and the sensitivities around pro-Palestinian rhetoric you mentioned earlier.
Right. But then the counterview is, no, RCV worked as intended. It reflected voter preferences more holistically. They'd argue Mamdani's platform on things like housing and wages clearly resonated with important groups in the city: younger voters, minority voters, progressives.
Which brings us back to that label, radically inappropriate. It really does depend on who you ask, doesn't it? His policies might fit NYC's progressive lean, but those past statements definitely raise flags for others.
It's a perfect example of how subjective that term radical can be. So maybe the takeaway isn't that RCV inherently produces radical winners, but perhaps it can amplify candidates with very strong, dedicated niche support, especially when turnout isn't super high.
And thinking about the future for New York City, this whole episode could have real consequences. We saw those X posts suggesting a push for a referendum to repeal RCV.
That's definitely out there now. It's a potential path. But, the flip side is, if they scrap RCV, they risk going back to the old system where someone could win the mayoralty with maybe only 30% of the vote if the field is fractured, which is exactly what RCV was brought in to avoid.
It's a real dilemma. What problem are you trying to solve, and does the solution create different problems?
That's the crux of it. It's a complex trade-off.
Okay, so that was our deep dive. Zohran Mamdani's primary win and the truly complex, nuanced role ranked choice voting played. The sources really do give us multiple ways to look at this RCV amplifying the base, RCV reflecting voter will, all mixed with the specific politics of NYC.
Absolutely. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. When we think about designing election systems, what is the ultimate goal? What's the balance we're trying to strike? Is it purely about ensuring a majority winner? Is it about giving strong, passionate bases a voice, encouraging broader appeal, reflecting every nuance of voter preference? And how might the mechanics of the system we choose inadvertently shape the kind of leaders we get, especially in a place as incredibly diverse and complex as New York City. Something to think about.